In common parlance, a lot of people will use the word translator to refer both to this and this. But in the professional jargon, the translator is only the person working with written language. Books, articles, reports, and the like. The person working with spoken or signed language is called an interpreter. Both translator and interpreter are taking things that are said in one language and repackaging them in another language. But there are some significant differences between the two, and the most salient difference is time constraints. Since they're working with written language, the translator has time to translate things multiple times, to read over their work again and correct things and polish things up if they need to. The interpreter doesn't have that luxury. The words just keep on coming and they have to come up with something fast. And once the words come out of their mouth, there's no turning back. What this means is that the translator can focus on finding the best way to say something, but the interpreter has to fall back on good enough options. And it's that feature of interpreting that makes their skill set interesting for us language learners. So here we're just going to do a tutorial on a handful of exercises that interpreter students do and that might be helpful for us language learners. I'll put a TLDW at the end of the video for people who just want the gist of it, but if you're like me and you sometimes need the explain to me like I'm 5 step-by-step explanation, that's what the rest of the video is going to be. These aren't exercises interpreters do to learn languages. I assume they learn languages the same way everyone does. No, these are exercises they do to practice getting good at interpreting, but we can still use them to get better at languages. We won't be switching between languages. You can do these in a single language, even in your mother tongue. So if you're one of those learners who wants to avoid translation because you're afraid it will impede your progress, these shouldn't be a problem. Plus, they're largely transversal skills, meaning that once you get good at it in one language, it should be pretty easy to replicate in another. Really, it's nothing fancy. What we're going to try to build up is on the one hand skills of analysis and summarizing, and on the other hand skills of reformulation. The reason these can be useful for us language learners is, well, let's use an analogy. On the comprehension side of things, so listening and reading, these skills are a bit like rounding numbers. If someone says the number pi equals 3.14159, and for whatever reason you missed the last 3 decimals, that's alright because you can fall back on 3.14. It's not wrong to say that pi equals 3.14, or 3.1, or even just 3. You're just rounding the number to the level you can manage. And you can train yourself to do something similar with language. That way, even if you miss something, if you can still keep track of the bigger picture, then you're fine. On the productive side of things, so speaking and writing, these skills are like a weird form of archery. Like, imagine a kind of archery where you have many different types of arrows that are each designed for specific targets. For each target, you have an arrow that matches it. The target is the message you're trying to get across, and your arrows are the knowledge you have of the language, vocabulary, grammar, and whatnot. A lot of language learning is focused on building up your quiver so you have as many arrows as possible. So if the target requires a specific arrow, you're sure to have it in your quiver. But what if you don't have the right arrow? Maybe you haven't learned the word yet, or maybe you have, but you're tired and just can't remember it. What do you do then? Some learners just shut down. I don't have the right arrow, so there's no way I can make the shot. But you can actually practice how to make that shot even if you don't have the right arrow. If you're working towards a CEFR exam, where these skills really come into play is at the C2 level. In the self-descriptors for C2, you have lines like, I can backtrack and restructure around the difficulty so smoothly that other people are hardly aware of it. Or it also says that you can present a clear, smoothly flowing description or argument with an effective logical structure. Or I can write summaries and reviews of professional literary works. So that's really where these skills come into play, but personally I find that they can be just as useful, if not more so, at the earlier levels. Alright, let's get to it. The first thing you're going to want to do is choose a short text to work with. It could be anything and everything, but it's probably easier to start with non-fiction essays. You'll want something with some kind of logical or narrative structure to it. If it's fiction, choose a passage where something's happening, so you have causality and a timeline or something. If it's just a description of scenery or something like that, the exercise really isn't going to work all that well. Since we talked a little bit about metaphors in the last video, we'll be working off the first paragraph of the book Metaphors We Live by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. It's really short, so let me just give it a quick read first. Metaphor is for most people a device of the poetic imagination and the rhetorical flourish, a matter of extraordinary rather than ordinary language. Moreover, metaphor is typically viewed as characteristic of language alone, a matter of words rather than thought or action. For this reason, most people think they can get along perfectly well without metaphor. We have found, on the contrary, that metaphor is pervasive in everyday life, not just in language, but in thought and action. Our ordinary conceptual system, in terms of which we both think and act, is fundamentally metaphorical in nature. Okay, so the first exercise we can do with this is to analyze and summarize the text. First, we're going to summarize each idea and try to single out the linking words. And by linking words, I mean, all the little words and expressions that connect ideas together. Words like if, then, but, however, and so on. Okay, so first sentence, I'm going to summarize that idea as most people think metaphor is about poetry and rhetoric. Close enough. We'll call that idea A. In the second sentence, we have one of those linking words, moreover, which is just a fancy way of saying and. We'll summarize that idea as most people think metaphor is just about language, and we'll call that idea B. Then in the third sentence, we have another linking word, linking expression, for this reason, which just means so, or therefore. We'll summarize the idea in this sentence as they think they don't need metaphor, and we'll call that idea C. So far, our structure is A and B, so C. Then in the fourth sentence, we have our last link, on the contrary, which is just a fancy way of saying but. And we'll summarize the idea in this sentence as they're wrong. And we'll call that idea D. And then we have the last sentence, and we'll call that idea E, and summarize it something like metaphor is fundamental to the way we think and act. You could add an implied link here, as so, but we'll just leave that aside for now. So that's our structure. A and B, so C, but D, E. So now if we want to summarize the paragraph, there are different levels of abstraction we can use. So if you remember the analogy of rounding numbers, the equivalent of saying pi equals 3.14159 would be to use the full structure. But we can round it up at higher decimals. What's the main idea in this paragraph? Like, if you had to keep just one idea, which one would it be? I think it's E. Metaphor is fundamental to the way we think and act. It's the conclusion, and everything else is just leading up to that idea. So if we wanted to say pi equals 3 and round up at that level of abstraction, we could summarize the paragraph as idea E and leave out all the rest. But what if we wanted to round up in the middle and say pi equals 3.14? Personally, the way I do that is by ditching A and B, and I just keep the structure C but D, E. So what you'd get in full is most people think they don't need metaphor, but they're wrong. Language is fundamental to the way we think and act. So those are the basics. You just take a text, break it down into individual ideas, highlight the words that connect those ideas one to the other, and then you try and summarize the text at different levels of abstraction. If you're aware of the structure like that, then it can help you patch things up if you miss something. Like, here we have A and B, so C. Imagine you miss B, you don't hear it or you don't understand it. Since you still know what the overall structure is, you could patch things up by saying something like A is one of the reasons why C, which in full would be something like most people think metaphor is about poetry and rhetoric. That's one of the reasons why they think they don't need metaphor. So I missed something, but I can still keep track of the argument. One of the things we can do now is play around with the structure a bit. A and B is the same thing as B and A, so you can flip those two if you want. Most people think metaphor is just about language. Moreover, most people think it's just about poetry and rhetoric. The meaning's the same. We could also flip the so around and turn it into a because. The original says A and B so C, but we can turn that into C because A and B. So then we'd have something like, most people think they don't need metaphor because they think metaphor is just about poetry and rhetoric, and that it's just about language. It still means the same thing, it's just structured differently. And that's that. It's nothing too fancy, right? It's just something to do in short stints, like maybe 10 minutes here and there, nothing more. And at some point, you get the hang of it, and it becomes pretty much automatic. The aim is to get used to keeping track of the overall structure. For interpreters, this skill is very important. In consecutive interpreting, interpreters listen to someone talk for a few minutes and they take notes. And when that person is done talking, they read their notes and interpret everything that person just said. A fairly common way of taking notes is to draw a margin on the side, and in that margin, you only keep the linking words. That way, they're keeping track of the shape of the argument. For language learners, well, some of you might have heard the advice, tolerate ambiguity, right? That's probably good advice, but if you develop these skills to keep track of the overall shape of the argument, tolerating ambiguity becomes a lot more comfortable and easier to do. The second type of exercise we're going to look at is reformulation. The first thing we're going to do here is just go through the text sentence by sentence and rewrite each one in as many ways as we can think of. So in the first sentence, we start with metaphor is for most people. Okay, what are other ways to say for most people? I could say the majority of people, the bulk of people, more than half of people. Then maybe I could fall back on some options that don't mean exactly the same thing, but close enough. Like, I could say for many people, for a lot of people, for loads of people. Then maybe I could say something like, in general, people think metaphor is, or people typically think that metaphor is. And we could also flip it around and use antonyms. Like, well, it's a bit stilted, but something like, only for a minority of people is metaphor more than just a device of... Anyway, that's the main idea. You just go through the text and try to find as many options as possible to say the same thing. Then what we can do is add some kind of arbitrary rule or constraint. Like, say, rewrite the text without using any passive voice. Looking through the text, it looks like there's just one passive. Here in the second sentence, metaphor is typically viewed as. So we could swap that to active voice by writing, we typically view metaphor as, something like that. Or the rule could be the other way around. Don't use any active voice. That's a bit harder. Some of it's going to sound really stilted, but like we could turn we have found metaphor to be into metaphor has been found by us to be. It's pretty stilted, but anyway, that's an option. Or in the last sentence, we have in terms of which we both think and act. To turn that into passive voice, we could say in terms of which both our thoughts and actions are driven. Or something like that. You get the idea. The rule could also be something like banning certain words, like a game of taboo, or having to use certain words, like a game of bingo. Like, say, rewrite the text without using the verb to be. And I might get something like this. Like in the first sentence where it says metaphor is for most people, I might switch that to most people see metaphor as a device. Or in the fourth sentence where it says metaphor is pervasive in everyday life, I might swap that out and say metaphor pervades everyday life instead. Or I could also use a more abstract rule, like, say, rewrite the text using as many words as possible related to water. And I might get something like this, like, metaphor is pervasive in everyday life. I might say something like, everyday life is drenched in metaphor. Oh. That sounds a bit silly, but... or maybe metaphor irrigates everyday life? Oh, I don't know. I'm honestly not great at this, but you get the idea. They get by just fine without metaphor. I could say they sail through life just fine without metaphor, something like that. These are all a bit silly, but you get the idea. I'll end with one last example that's useful for interpreters when they learn how to do simultaneous interpreting. Simultaneous interpreting is when they interpret at the same time the person is speaking. And here the rule is to reformulate everything in sentences that are as short as possible. For interpreters, this is useful because they want to get chunks of meaning out of the way as fast as possible. I've heard one interpreter describe it like parking cars. You take one small chunk of meaning, park it, move on to the next one, park it, and so on. If you try to park all your cars at once, things can get messy, so best to park them one at a time. So the last sentence, for instance, we might say something like, we both think and act in terms of our ordinary conceptual system, end the sentence there, then start a new one. That ordinary conceptual system stems from metaphor, or something like that. Anyway, these are just a few examples. Use your imagination. There are endless options to how you could do this. The point is to train yourself to use whichever arrows you happen to have in your quiver, even if it's not the ideal one. That way, when you're talking in the language you're learning, if you can't think of the word you want, you'll easily be able to fall back on another good enough option. So there you have it. It's not something to spend all that much time on, well, unless you want to become an interpreter, of course. But it can come in handy for language learning. The good news is that these are largely transversal skills, meaning that if you get good at it in one language, it's pretty easy to replicate in any other language you end up learning. There is one potential downside though, and that's just that you can get so good at it that you end up relying on those skills at the expense of building up accuracy. Like, if I can make any shot with just 3 arrows, why bother working to get all these other arrows, right? So that's just something to bear in mind and be careful with. You still need to keep building up your vocabulary and whatnot, no matter how good you get at reformulation and summarizing. And that's about it. Nothing fancy, just some short exercises that might be worth trying out and fitting into your routine if ever you find them helpful. Alright, so the next video is going to be, well, it's not going to be a detailed tutorial like this one, but it's still going to be focused on the practical side of language learning. We're going to talk about value capture, some of the problems that can arise with using metrics like Duolingo streaks and whatnot, and what we can do about it. And then after that, it's going to be a longer video on linguistics about the whole Piraha controversy. And that's that. Okay, bye.